Recently, I headed up to Manchester to be involved in a video for Reason Studios, which, if you've not seen, is linked in the description. And while I was up there, I thought it's only right that I take the hour train ride west to Liverpool, the hometown of my favourite band, The Beatles. I'd made a flying visit to Liverpool once before for a gig, but I never got a chance to see all of the historical and notable Beatles-related sites. So today I'll be showing you my Beatles pilgrimage, and whilst I'm there I'll be answering some questions submitted by you guys about the Fab Four. The first question comes from Snackman, and he asks, what happened to the Cavern Club and what's there now? The Cavern Club was of course the famous club where the Beatles made almost 300 performances before getting their big break in 1963. However, although it stands on the spot of the original Cavern, this Cavern Club here is not the original building. Despite the building's obvious history and notoriety, the original cavern was actually demolished in 1973 to make way for some railway infrastructure that never even got built. When the original building was demolished, the club moved a few doors down the road to here, a premises that now houses a club called Eric's. However, as you can see, there is a Cavern Club standing here today. After it was demolished in 1973 and the planned railway construction didn't happen, in 1982, a new replica cavern was opened on the original site. Although due to building limitations, this new Cavern Club is actually 90 degrees off from the footprint of the original club. But it is fantastic that this historic club has been resurrected and serves as a busy music venue to this day. So that behind me is actually Penny Lane, and I thought this would be a good place to talk about Paul McCartney and his bass lines. Matthias asks, which of Paul McCartney's bass lines do you feel is the most beautiful from all of the Beatles songs? So Paul McCartney certainly had a knack for an interesting bass line. I remember when I was playing bass for a gig years and years ago, and we were playing Nowhere Man, and I remember I think it was the first time I really found a bass line that wasn't just the root notes. You know, so many bass lines stick to the root notes and that works, but Paul McCartney bass lines don't. They have amazing walking melodies, often I think very much inspired by the jazz that Paul McCartney's dad would have been playing when he was growing up. Now if you're asking what the most beautiful Paul McCartney bass line is, I think I'd probably have to go for Something, which is obviously a George Harrison song, but Paul's bass line for Something really brings an extra element to the song. He not only often chooses to play notes that aren't the root note, as I discussed recently in my Songs That Use Inversion video, but he's also quite melodic with his bass, really complementing the rest of the arrangement. In 1968, John Lennon sang
a soap impression of his wife, which he ate and donated to the National Trust.
Well, I wonder if he could have guessed that 34 years later, his wife, Yoko Ono, would purchase his childhood home, 251 Menlove Road, and then donate it to the National Trust. This house, just like Paul McCartney's childhood home at 20 Forthland Road, are preserved by the National Trust as sites of historical and cultural significance. It was here at John's home that he and Paul wrote Please Please Me and I'll Get You, and it was at Paul's home that the band would regularly rehearse and wrote many more of their early hits, including I Saw Her Standing There, She Loves You and Love Me Do. So I'm currently walking the 30 minutes between John Lennon's childhood home and Paul McCartney's childhood home, a walk I'm sure the boys did regularly because they both practiced at Paul's house and they wrote many songs there. So I thought whilst I'm doing this walk it'd be a great opportunity to answer more of your questions. Graham Houghton asks, what are a few Beatles songs that were lifted to greatness by a contribution from George Martin? So first of all, anytime you hear orchestration on a Beatles song, be that strings, horns, woodwinds, anything like that, that is the work of George Martin, bar a few exceptions. And he not only orchestrated that, organised it, conducted it, but he often wrote most of those parts. So if you take a song like Strawberry Fields Forever, or I Am the Walrus, or All You Need Is Love, or Eleanor Rigby, those songs really rely on George Martin's contribution. If you removed George Martin's contribution from those songs, you'd be left with very little. Also, George Martin was a very talented piano player, so whenever the Beatles wanted a more sophisticated piano solo in one of their songs, they would turn to George Martin, who would write and perform a part. Some of his most noteworthy piano solos would be Lovely Rita, and the piano solo from In My Life, which George Martin famously composed only to find out that he'd written something too complex even for him to play. So what he had to do was record it at half the tempo and then double the tape speed afterwards to get the desired result. So I'm trying to get to a very particular location before I answer the next question, which is what my favourite Beatles song is. But I'm quite literally being taken on a magical mystery tour around Liverpool to get here, because it seems like Google Maps hasn't been updated or something, because every route I try and take to get to this particular place that's very, very relevant to the song I want to tell you about, I reach a dead end, and I'm getting pretty exhausted, but you know, it's all worth it. But yeah, hopefully I'll be there soon. So in what should be a short walk from John Lennon's childhood home is a children's home run by the Salvation Army called Strawberry Field, which of course is what inspired the song Strawberry Fields Forever, which is my favourite Beatles song. And even today, the premises is still run by the Salvation Army and now operates as a cafe and community centre. Pomar asks, best non-Beatles song which sounds like the Beatles? I'd have to say Mrs. Robinson by Simon & Garfunkel, not just because it's a great song, and also not just because it's one of only 2 songs that use the lyric Cuckoo Cuckoo, but mainly because when I was younger I actually thought it was by the Beatles. I don't know if you guys remember the illegal downloading software called LimeWire, where you could pirate music, but when I was 11 or 12 that was one of the main ways I found music. Don't report me to the police. And on there, Mrs. Robinson was incorrectly labelled as being by the Beatles, and as a 11-year-old I didn't know any better, so at the time, and for many years actually, I thought it was a Beatles song. About half an hour's walk from Strawberry Fields is St. Peter's Church. It was here on July 6th, 1957 that John Lennon and Paul McCartney first met. John's band, the Quarrymen, were playing at a dance that night at the church, and Paul, who was already an enthusiastic and talented musician, was introduced to John by a mutual friend. But that's not the only link to the Beatles that this church has. Amongst the gravestones in this churchyard, there is actually a grave for a Eleanor Rigby. And the spooky bit is that Paul McCartney claims that this grave wasn't actually the inspiration for the song.
I like the name Eleanor. We've been working with an actress called Eleanor Braun. I was looking for this Eleanor Papa to make the rhythm. I happened to be in Bristol, and I saw a shop that said Rigby. So I thought, oh great, Eleanor Rigby. So now I had the name of my main character. But then years later, somebody else is researching this, and they said, you know, in that village where where John used to live, there's a graveyard in the church. And there is a gravestone there to an Eleanor Rigby. So I thought, did I subconsciously know that name? I think it's maybe a coincidence, but there is a gravestone in Liverpool, in a place called Woolton, where me and John met, that does say Eleanor Rigby.
And Eleanor Rigby isn't the only noteworthy grave in this churchyard. A few rows over is the grave of George Toogood Smith, John Lennon's uncle, who he lived with along with his Aunt Mimi at 251 Menlove Avenue. Manuela Garibotti asks, I've seen some people say that Ringo was lucky to be part of the Beatles and wasn't as good or as vital as his bandmates. What do you think about that? I think a lot of people try measuring Ringo's value in terms of his technicality as a drummer, and by that metric then no, he's not the greatest drummer in the world, but that isn't the sort of drummer that the Beatles needed. Not only is their music not, prog rock, but the ultimate thing that the Beatles needed was a cohesive set of personalities that could actually survive long enough to make music and to get through the intense journey they had in their short career. And I think Ringo is ultimately the calm, level-headed personality that they needed in a band full of 3 other very big egos. The next question is John or Paul, and why? The way I see it, John and Paul represent 2 pieces of the puzzle which created the magic of the Beatles. Ultimately, John was sort of the brute force, the aggression, and Paul was the sentimentality and the cheesiness, and together they had the perfect balance. You can see once you get into the solo careers, they're sort of two songwriter personalities coming through. John's aggressiveness and sort of brute force, rawness. And Paul's cheesiness and sentimentality. So really, choosing between the two is like choosing half of the equation. But if I had to choose between the two, it would be John. And if you took a list of my favourite Beatles songs, the majority of them are John Lennon songs. But yeah, caveat, you can't pick and choose. They come as a bundle. So as you can see, I'm now getting my tan standing in the English rain, but we'll continue answering questions. The next question is about whether or not the Beatles will still remain classic in 50 years' time, whether they'll still be remembered. And the way I see it, I imagine it panning out a bit like the great American songbook writers are remembered today, like George Gershwin, Cole Porter, Roger and Hart. These are the sort of songwriters where people will probably recognise those names, but not instantly be able to tell you which songs they wrote. But if you played them Summertime or Every Time We Say Goodbye or Putting on the Ritz, they'll know the song. So people might not be completely aware of which songs were written by the Beatles, and by extension which ones were written by John, which ones were written by Paul. But the idea of the Beatles catalogue of songs, particularly their well-known hits, are already so woven into our popular culture. They're effectively archetypes of rock and roll or pop music. So really, as long as people are interested in listening to music, the Beatles will be remembered. And as time goes on, the sort of noise of other artists will peel away, and I imagine the Beatles will remain one of the icons of 20th century music, much like Bach is an icon of Baroque music, or Miles Davis is an icon of jazz. As time passes, we forget about the less notable acts, and we're left with these icons. Ken Brotup asks, have any of the Beatles ever brought up the comparisons made between them and Oasis? Well, actually, in the 90s, George Harrison made the news when he expressed his dislike for Oasis.
And finally, Oasis lead singer Liam Gallagher has been greatly criticised by one of his biggest heroes, former Beatle George Harrison. Oasis have always made it well known what massive Beatles fans they are, but as far as George is concerned, the band would be better off without their lead singer.
He's like a bit out of date, you know. I mean, he's a bit of a. It's just silly. It's silly. I feel a bit sorry for him really, because I think he's totally missed the bus, and I think it was proven when you see the band without him singing. You know, they're more in tune, and they can. You know, I mean, he's just excess baggage, I think, and all he does is, you know, make people think what a bunch of prannies they are.
And as you can imagine, Liam Gallagher was less than pleased to have one of his idols bad talk Oasis.
I still love the Beatles, and I still love George Harrison as a songwriter in the Beatles, but as a person, I think he's a fucking nipple. And if I ever meet him, I'll tell him. And if you're watching it, nipple.
Potbreaker asks, which Beatle has your favourite solo career? So all of the Beatles actually had a fairly decent solo career, even Ringo did, which I can't actually think of any other band where all four members had a successful solo career after the band split. But if you're asking my favourite, it's a close match between Paul and John, and I think the thing is that Paul's quality of output declined after the 1970s. Stuff like Live and Let Die and Maybe I'm Amazed, that sort of stuff, that's fantastic. Band on the Run, that's great. But then it slowly just ventured more and more into what I call Paul McCartney's cheese land. So I'm tempted to say John Lennon, because some of my favourite John Lennon songs like Jealous Guy and Mother and Imagine were written after the Beatles, obviously. But the thing is, John has the unfair advantage of having died in the 1980s, so he never got a chance to sort of lose his edge, if you know what I mean. So all in all, I think I have to say John, but Paul, like every other artist ever, slowly has lost his edge as he's got older. But you know, he has a free pass because he's already written some of the greatest songs of all time. What's the best piano riff in the Beatles catalogue? Hey Bulldog. What song made you fall in love with the Beatles? Hey Bulldog. Which covers of a Beatles song do you believe are better than the originals, or at least add something new enough to be interesting? I think the two Beatles songs that I would prefer to listen to the covers than the originals are Joe Cocker's version of With a Little Help and Ella Fitzgerald's version of Can't Buy Me Love.
I don't care too much for money can't buy me love.
Which Beatles song would you say had the best chord progression? I think the most interesting chord progression across the entire Beatles catalogue, which is a big statement, is I Am the Walrus. It not only avoids having any minor chords at all, but it manages to build a major chord on every degree of the A minor scale. If you've not seen it already, I actually made an analysis video of this chord progression, so do go check that out. So thank you to everybody who submitted questions for this video, and as always a big thank you goes to everyone who supports me on Patreon, with an extra special thank you going to these people.